Hi folks, welcome to day 35. Today we're going to be continuing working in section 9.1, working on simplifying radicals. So yesterday we learned a little bit more about the product property, had a little bit more practice with that than we did when we were working with that back in chapter 6. Today we're going to be working with a very similar notion, which is the quotient property. So remember that the product property said if you have two things that are being multiplied underneath one square root, you can split it into two square roots. Well, you can do the same thing when you're dividing. So if you have the square root of a divided by b, right? So a and b are being divided under one square root. You can split that into the square root of a divided by the square root of b, right? So that means if we had something like the square root of 9/4, well, that's messy. That's not going to be pretty, right? Like 9/4, that's like 2.25. The square root of 2.25, well, that's just, that's not very helpful for us. But if we were to split this up using our quotient property, instead of the square root of 9/4, if we had the square root of 9 over the square root of 4, well, now we can go ahead and simplify. All right, so when you're working with the quotient property, you're going to first start by taking your radical, your square root, all right, and splitting it like we did here. So we took our square root of 9/4, all right, and then we split it up into the square root of 9 divided by the square root of 4, okay, and then we simplify each radical individually. So the square root of 9 gives us plus and minus 3, and the square root of 4 gives us plus and minus 2. So our final answer would be plus and minus 3/2. All right, so that quotient property just tells us, yep, we're going to take our big square root and split it into two smaller square roots. If we have two things being divided underneath one square root, we can split it up into two. But this is like an easy example, right? Let's go ahead and work with something that's a little bit more difficult. So if we had the square root of 27/32, all right, we're trying to simplify that. Your first step in these problems, all right, your first step is you're gonna have to break it into your two radicals. So you're gonna take this square root and break it up into two separate square roots. So I'm going to take this square root of 27/32, and I'm going to take it and turn it into the square root of 27 divided by the square root of 32. All right? So that's step 1, break it into two radicals. Step 2, simplify each radical. In our top example, right, the square root of 9, that simplifies super easy, and so does the square root of 4. But you're not always working with easy things, are you? So let's go ahead and try out a harder one, right? So we've got the square root of 27 divided by the square root of 32. We're going to simplify each of them individually. So I'm going to simplify the square root of 27. All right? We learned yesterday that that was 3 times the square root of 3. So now let's go ahead and simplify the square root of 32. Well, I know that my first step is to write out my factors, right? Make a factor tree. So I have 1 and 32, right? 2 and 16. 32 doesn't go into 3, but we get 4 and 8. And then we get 6 and 7. So we've listed out all of our factors, because remember the next one would be 7 and 6, and 7 times 6 is the same thing as 6 times 7. Oh, I'm so sorry. 6 times 7 is 42. I'm silly. 4 times 8 is our last factor, because 8 times 4 is also 32. I thought it was a little weird. This makes more sense now. All right, so you have 3 factors, 1 and 32, 2 and 16, 4 and 8. Okay? Remember that after you write out your factors from your factor tree, you have to pick your biggest perfect squares. So I have my perfect square of 1, just like always, but we know that we're never going to pick that, right? If you're picking the square root of 1, or if you're picking 1 as one of your factors, you're saying this can't be simplified. All right, but we also have 16, because remember, the square root of 16 is 4, well, plus and minus 4. And we also have 4, because remember, the square root of 4 is 2, right? Or 2 squared is 4. So we have factors in every single pair. But remember, you're always going to choose the biggest perfect square. So our biggest perfect square out of 1, 16, and 4, the biggest number is 16. So that's going to be the one we pick. So I'm going to take my square root of 32, and instead of having the square root of 32, I'm now going to have the square root of 2 times 16. All right. And when we do that, we can then split it into the square root of 2 times the square root of 16. But remember, the square root of 16 is just plus and minus 4, and we always write that first. So I have plus and minus 4 times the square root of 2. All right? All right, so first step was to break into 2 radicals. Check, we did that. Second step, simplify each radical. Simplify the top, simplify the bottom. All right, check, check. Step 3. Put them back together. And when I say put them back together, what I mean is we had the square root of 27 over the square root of 32. We simplified each of those individually, right? We have the square root of 27 was plus and minus the square 3 times the square root of 3. All right, so I've now replaced the square root of 27 with that plus and minus 3 times the square root of 3. But we also have that square root of 32, which is plus and minus 4 times the square root of 2. All right, so I'm going to replace my square root of 32 with plus and minus 4 times the square root of 30, or times the square root of 2. So then my final answer, okay, so square root of 27 32nds. The simplest form of that would be 3 times the square root of 3 over 4 times the square root of 2 with that plus and minus out front. This would be our final answer. Okay? So, step 1, split your big radical into 2 radicals, all right, a top radical and a bottom radical. Step 2, simplify each of the individual radicals. Step 3, put them back together into one quotient, one dividing term. All right, so that's all you're gonna do in your examples today. All right, or in your problems for today. I want you to try to simplify using a quotient, right? Trying to break up a quotient into a final term, just like we did here. All right? Again, if you have any questions, make sure you're emailing me, okay? I can't know that you're struggling if you don't reach out, and Canvas doesn't notify me if you, write it on your paper. And sometimes it takes me, a couple days to get to the papers. Sometimes it takes me a couple weeks to get to the papers. So feel free to email me, all right? Have a great weekend and enjoy some time outside if you can.